Hello, and welcome to Educational Renaissance, promoting a rebirth of ancient wisdom for the modern era. My name is Jason Barney, and today I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about Bloom's taxonomy and the purpose of education. I'll be talking through some ideas from this recent blog article I shared, and I'm really excited about this one because we're starting a big series here on both Bloom's taxonomy and Aristotle's 5 intellectual virtues and how they can replace Bloom's taxonomy with a classical taxonomy of educational objectives. Well, to start, let me tell you a little bit about the purpose of education. You know, in the classical school movement as a whole, we've been really trying to recover something of this broader and more holistic purpose of education that the classical tradition had espoused. And in particular, we've been showing how modern education has become too utilitarian, too focused on just job training or college preparation, preparing people for being good citizens of the state and nothing else. One good example of this is Joseph Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture, where Joseph Pieper talks about how leisure, actually having free time to study, is all about stepping back from the workaday world to contemplate things. It's not about being primarily focused in a utilitarian way on what you can get out of something, and that there's something about that that's particularly human and transcendent. Chris Perrin, the founder of Classical Academic Press, has recently drawn attention to this, pointing out that the word school comes from the Greek skole, which meant leisure. And so school should be about these transcendent things, about not just utilitarian ends, but embracing the deepness of what it means to be human and longing to know for its own sake as its own goal. There's a real joy in that. Just check out my series on flow or the book, The Joy of Learning, for an example of that. Another way that the classical education movement has pointed in this direction comes from David Hicks's Norms and Nobility, which is an incredible treatise on education. And one of the points he makes is how in the modern world, our utilitarian focus on making good citizens for the state has so taken over that educators have become those who hold power and pass power on to others. As we've kind of focused in this postmodern world on the dynamics of power, we lose the love of learning, the love and joy of it in and of itself, as well as these broader questions, asking the age-old questions again, trying to conform our souls to what is noble, to the norms, the ideal type that has haunted us for generation upon generation. A last and final example of this classical education push for a broader purpose of education is, I think, best summarized in C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, where he pointed out back in the 40s something very similar. He used the example of what he called the Green Book, not saying exactly what educational textbook it was, but it was a secondary school English textbook that he pointed out was not really teaching English to its students. Instead, it was trying to indoctrinate them into this philosophical position that human values, are not real. They're just subjective preferences. All we should know is the facts, facts, facts. It makes me think of that great section from a Dickens novel about Mr. Gradgrind, the teacher who just wanted facts, facts, facts. And the point for Lewis was that when we do this, when we just focus on the mind and facts to the neglect of training hearts, training affections, we're actually abolishing something that's crucial to man and setting up and paving the way for totalitarian states to manipulate us. With that preface about the purpose of education, go forward a decade from Lewis's abolition of man and across the Atlantic, and we see Bloom and a group of educators, most of whom dealt with university examinations, creating a taxonomy of educational objectives. Now, we all probably, if you're an educator, have heard of Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. It's one of those things that have just become part of the landscape of education today. We might not think it has anything to do with the broader purpose of education, but when you talk about educational objectives, educational goals, I think that's interacting with this broader question of purpose necessarily. And there may be many things that are good about us as educators getting very clear about what our objective is for this lesson, what our objectives are for that course that we're working. What are we actually wanting students to have accomplished, to have learned, to be able to do at the end of this lesson or course? That's very important. It's important to have goals. We are teleological creatures, if we can reference Aristotle. And goals and targets help us get where we want to go. So there's a lot that's good about Bloom's educational taxonomy. But I think there are some problems. Let me just run through what his 6 areas are, or 6 objectives in big picture in the cognitive domain, which is what he published with a group of educators in the 1950s. The 6 broad educational objectives are knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And these are great goals, and they have subcategories for each one. But one thing I've felt, having been handed them from one of my first years of teaching at a classical Christian school, and said, hey, make sure that your students are cultivating higher orders of thinking. One of the unfortunate realities is that I believe Bloom's taxonomy has contributed to this modern educational focus on the intellect to the neglect of the heart and the body. And in the classical tradition, we've been trying to recover this more holistic training of head, heart, and body all together. To be fair to Bloom and his colleagues, they weren't necessarily trying to do this. They had in mind both a cognitive domain and an affective domain, which they published a little bit more than a decade later. But that one isn't very well read, not much distributed, not used in the same way. They were really most focused on the cognitive domain. They didn't even publish their 3rd grouping, the psychomotor domain, though in the 70s and later, other educators have proposed kind of subheadings or a subcategorization for that domain. So they had in mind that they would deal with cognitive, affective, and psychomotor, head, heart, and body, but they participated in a modern educational establishment that has been unfortunately so focused on the head to the neglect of the heart. It makes me think of Desiring the Kingdom by Jamie K. Smith, and how he argued that we in the modern world have conceived of ourselves as thinking things primarily, drawing from Descartes and this Enlightenment philosophical tradition that neglected the other parts of who we are. And Bloom and his colleagues were really just trying to systematize the words and terms that people were already using and get them into currency so that educators could be clear and not ambiguous about their goals. So they had a pretty modest goal there, so we shouldn't blame them too much. But I think this points us to the question. We really should analyze Bloom's taxonomy and see if maybe there is a better way of conceiving of this whole project. So that's what I'm going to do here in this series, and I'm really excited to first look at Bloom's taxonomy and analyze what's valuable and good about it. what can we gain? Because we may need to go back, and that's what I'm suggesting, that we go back to Aristotle's intellectual virtues and use those instead. But we don't want to do so blindly. If we're going to backtrack, C.S. Lewis talks about if we're trying to progress, sometimes we have to backtrack if we've gone astray on a side route. We may have to backtrack, but it'd be better if we knew where we thought we went astray so that we could search for the right path there. So we're not going to just dismiss Bloom's taxonomy. We're going to analyze it first, but then we're going to backtrack and see if we can take Aristotle's distinctions of 5 intellectual virtues as the way forward. And you might think to yourself at this point that proposing intellectual virtues instead of Bloom's taxonomy seems like it's not going to accomplish the point I made earlier about having head, heart, and body integrated in a fully orbed purpose of education. But actually, one of the things that's striking about Aristotle's intellectual virtues, which are art or artistry or craftsmanship, Greek word is techne. The second is scientific knowledge. The third is phronesis, practical wisdom or prudence. The fourth is intuition or comprehension, and called nous in the Greek. And fifth is philosophic wisdom, Sophia. And the thing that is striking about these 5 intellectual virtues for Aristotle is how they actually interact with the heart and the body. They are focused on the intellect perceiving truth, but, for instance, artistry or techne involves the body in so many of its processes and connects to what we do bodily and habitually. And in a similar way, phronesis or practical wisdom, which is, I think, one of the most neglected virtues in our modern day, is connected right to the heart and the moral virtues. There's this whole passage where Aristotle talks how phronesis is intimately involved in the moral virtues, and you cannot have practical wisdom or prudence without also being morally virtuous. So our intellectual virtues, as we go through Aristotle, will connect well and elicit this broader holistic purpose of education. The other thing that I'm really excited about is that I think when you get Aristotle's intellectual virtues, truly get them, and see things from his conceptual vantage point, it sheds so much light on the history of the liberal arts tradition. Why do we call them the liberal arts, for instance? Why do we have the sciences? This all comes, I think, out of Aristotle's intellectual virtues. Whether or not it was started before him, he's really crystallized these excellences of the mind and how in attaining them, we are really there. We've really grown and matured intellectually. And I think those things are our legitimate main or core goals of education. So I'm going to propose that we use them as our educational objectives. So first in this series, we're going to talk through Bloom's, what's good about it, what's bad, what's ugly. And then we're going to propose Aristotle's 5 intellectual virtues, unpack each of those, drawing from Aristotle, interacting with him, developing his thoughts, because the 6th book of the Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about the intellectual virtues, doesn't go in too much detail, though it's very suggestive, and so I'll be having to draw out from him how I think this applies in a modern educational context. And what are all the changes, lastly, that this will involve? How will our pedagogy shift if we take Aristotle's intellectual virtues as our goals? What would that change in terms of our curriculum? What we're doing day in and day out in our lesson planning and our classrooms. I'm really excited for this series. I hope you can tell that. So stay tuned, and we'll dive into Bloom's taxonomy versus Aristotle's 5 intellectual virtues. Share in the comments if you have thoughts, what you're excited to see or interact with, what questions you have. I'm wrestling with a lot of different texts as I try and formulate this and develop this thought over a series of blog articles here. Thanks for listening. Promoting a rebirth of ancient wisdom for the modern era.